There will always be gaps between ideas and language, gaps between your perceptions and my perceptions, gaps between your feelings and my feelings. But here's the cool part. In the performing arts, and I would argue in education in general, we are in the business of navigating those untraversable gaps, of building bridges across difference. And we know as arts makers, and we know as educators, that it is in the gaps, in what is seemingly untranslatable, that the drama often happens.
Good evening. My name is Courtney Elkin-Moeller, and I am an associate professor here in the theater department at BC. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, Bill Rauch. I'm grateful to the Lowell Humanities Series, and especially to Sylvia Sellers-Garcia, who works behind the scenes to ensure these events are meaningful and well executed. I believe that Bill will regale us with some of his many stories. So rather than introducing him via biography, I am taking a bit of an outside-in approach and will reflect a bit on how Bill's work in and ethos of the theater has impacted my own. Like Bill, I spent many of my early years in the theater on the West Coast. Bill co-founded Cornerstone Theater Company and served as its artistic director from 1986 through 2006, which means that when I took a seminar course at UCLA in radical theater, I was introduced to the company he led as a key example of how theater might be used to create and serve its community. Cornerstone brings together excellent professional artists to work in conversation and creative collaboration with people who do not consider themselves to be performers in order to create timely new plays based on the concerns of a given community. The work is deeply infused in social justice practices. As I direct today, I find myself returning to my early exposure to Cornerstone Theater to ground and focus why I direct. The point is never about the final product, but rather about the story making in community, making room for people to be seen and heard. And that idea is nothing short of radical. While other kids at UCLA drove south to Mexican beaches, I spent my spring breaks caravanning with a ragtag group of student theater majors, 10 hours north to the Mecca that is the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in Ashland, Oregon. And in fact, it became such a precious place to me that in 2008, I married my husband in Lithia Park. All us UCLA theater majors would sleep 8 to a room, mostly on the floor of a rickety but charming boarding house, the Columbia Hotel, and spend our money on student tickets to see 2 shows a day, often eating nothing but bread and peanut butter in order to do so. And here again was Bill Rauch, stage director, and later artistic director. As I looked back in the archives, I can report that I've seen many of the shows you directed, Bill, including the spectacular ancient Sanskrit drama, The Clay Cart, Equivocation, written by a Jesuit, Bill Kane, and of course, Off the Rails by Choctaw playwright and my mentor, Randy Reinholtz. After directing for 5 years at OSF, Bill became the artistic director of the company in 2007. Quickly, he got to work doubling down on the institution's diversity, inclusion, and empowerment efforts, pioneering artist development programs that he put emerging BIPOC artists into paid creative opportunities that would help launch their careers. Under his leadership, OSF boasted a majority BIPOC company. In his final season as artistic director, actors of color made up 70% of the performers. And I would like to mention that this was a very important harbinger for some of the radical measures that have been taken since then in repertory companies around the country, but it began early at OSF under Bill's leadership. The thing about repertory companies in the 21st century is that not many can rest on their laurels, but the ones that can generally do. To be more specific, when your company has a dedicated subscriber base and has become an annual field trip to dozens of school-aged children, seasons can, and often do, become programmatically formulaic, offering mostly literary and Eurocentric shows that are palatable to a wide audience and affirm pre-existing expectations. This is not how Bill Rauch leads. There is too much inequity, injustice, and aesthetic complicity in the aforementioned recipe for success. What I watched as a college student, then as a doctoral student of critical studies in theater, and finally as a young professional director, dramaturg, and theater scholar, was an OSF busy turning up rocks and tearing down fences, expanding whose stories are worthy of theatricalizing, and centering an array of aesthetics to tell these stories. To this end, Bill spearheaded one of the most fruitful endeavors in the building of a more diverse and inclusive American theater. When OSF commissioned 37 new plays to dramatize moments of change in US history. Among the plays created in the American Revolutions, the US history cycle, are Sweat by Lynn Nottage, The Confederates by Dominique Morisseau, and Between Two Knees by the 1491s. I have had the pleasure of seeing, writing about, and teaching many of these plays, and was inspired by this collection to create my class here at BC, It's Not a Moment, It's a Movement, BIPOC Plays for the 21st Century. My own work is in the study, development, and directing of Indigenous theater. So I must wrap up here by highlighting Bill's work as a white ally to my community in Native theater. When Bill directed Randy Reinholtz's Off the Rails, which retells Shakespeare's Measure for Measure within the brutal history of Indian residential boarding schools, it started a revolution itself. This was the first time OSF had ever produced a play by a Native American playwright. And its box office success and critical acclaim proved what we in Native theater had already known. Theater people have an appetite for good stories, and Native people have some good stories to share. OSF has gone on to produce more works by Native playwrights and was, I believe, a key influence on the theater industry to make and hold space for our work. Bill left OSF in 2019 and has been busy as the inaugural artistic director of the Perelman Performing Arts Center in New York City, where he continues to be dedicated to active allyship, artistic excellence, and community-engaged theater making. I was, as a teen, and continue to be now, deeply inspired by his theater ethos, committed to creating big, spectacular, but sometimes soft and intimate, and always breathtaking spaces of inclusion. Thank you for being such a light in my life, and you all now get to hear from the man himself.
Hi, everybody. That was so beautiful, Courtney. I'm so moved to know how connected our lives have been without even spending a lot of time together. Thank you. I'm just taking that in for a minute. So I'm going to share some remarks I prepared. They'll go on for a while. Hopefully there'll be some useful and interesting things in them. And then I really look forward to our conversation. I'm eager to hear your questions. When I was in 7th grade, I went on a field trip to see what was to become a life-changing production for me, life-changing production of A Midsummer Night's Dream at Yale Repertory Theater. When we returned to the classroom, we were assigned Shakespeare's play to read. And I was struck by my fellow students' challenges with this archaic language. So I decided to help. And in this unlikely fit of hubris, I rewrote the entire play into modern English. My teacher was impressed enough by what I had done that the next year I was able to get out of gym class for several months, which I was very happy about, to direct that year's 7th graders in a production of my version of that play. It was my first adaptation, and it was my first time serving as a director. I was already obsessed with how adaptation could build bridges between there and here, between then and now, between them and us. And so at 12 years of age, my life's work began. I am really honored to have been asked to speak to you all this evening. Some Boston College faculty, staff, students, and even some members of the public. You all apparently care enough about the performing arts and the intersection between the performing arts and social justice to attend tonight's talk. And for that, I am truly grateful. I went to college in Cambridge, and the Boston community has often been at the center of my life ever since. So I especially appreciate the gift that this talk has given me, an opportunity to reflect on my career and to share those reflections with you tonight. Adaptations are especially on my mind these days, literary and theatrical adaptations, but also life adaptations. 5 years ago this summer, I stepped down from being the artistic director of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. It had been my home for 12 years. My family and I moved across the country to New York City so that I could become, as Courtney mentioned, the inaugural artistic director of the Perelman Performing Arts Center, PAC NYC, as we call it for short. But this was, of course, not my first time at the rodeo of a major job change. 18 years ago, after 20 years at the helm, I transitioned from Cornerstone Theater Company, a community-based company that I had co-founded in my early adulthood. And I transitioned from that to running the country's largest rotating repertory theater. Before I talk about that repertory company, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, I want to give you some context about Cornerstone, as its lessons remain to me invaluable. And I hope some might have value for you as well. Cornerstone began in 1986, but its genesis was a few years earlier when some friends and I heard a dreadful statistic that 98% of Americans didn't go to professional theater on anything approaching a regular basis. In fact, a professor of ours told us that theater was a dying art form. Of course, we loved the theater, and we hope to prove our esteemed professor wrong. The easiest way, it seemed, to find out why people didn't feel that theater was an important part of their lives was to get to know them. And for us, we thought, what better way to get to know somebody than to do a show with them? So there were 11 founding members of Cornerstone. We bought a big blue van. We went into a lot of debt to buy a big blue van, and we hit the road. We moved into tiny rural towns with populations anywhere from 200 people to 2,000 people that had no active tradition of live theater. We spent 5 years living from 2 to 4 months at a time in communities across the United States, from Virginia to North Dakota, Maine to Florida to Texas, and plenty of places in between. And we mounted plays with first-time actors of all ages for an audience of their families and their neighbors. We turned a welding shop, a city hall basement, an abandoned high school gymnasium, and a cattle auction barn into theaters. We also lived in unusual places because we raised the cash costs of our project ourselves. We only asked our hosts to provide performance space and housing in what we called otherwise unoccupied facilities. We didn't want to be exchange students. We didn't want to live with families. We wanted to live on our own as young professionals. So in practice, that meant that we lived in everything from some really smelly trailers in the leaf of a highway clover to an abandoned fast food restaurant to that vacant high school where we would cook in the home ec room, we would shower in the locker room, and we would roller skate through the hallways in the wee hours of the morning. After 5 years of work with rural communities, we chose to settle down in Los Angeles because of its remarkable diversity of communities. In LA, it really is like you're in driving distance of the whole world. And what started as just a 2-year kind of experimental urban residency became a home. Cornerstone is now in its 38th year of working with urban and rural communities. It's continuing to thrive under a recently appointed pair of new artistic directors. During my 2 decades as the artistic head of a community-based theater, we learned so much. We learned that what we did always succeeded, even amidst occasional spectacular failure. People were always willing to come together across huge divisions in order to create art, whether they were black and white citizens who had been locked in a 2-decade-long economic boycott in a segregated Mississippi town, fundamentalist Christians and atheists debating the true nature of morality in a timber town in the Pacific Northwest, or neighbors in a South Los Angeles neighborhood who, because of rival gangs, feared crossing a block to be in a show. Surprisingly courageous individuals again and again crossed lines to make something beautiful. We learned that everyone has a story to tell. When we did an adaptation of Moliere's play Tartuffe in a Great Plains farming town of 250 people at the height of the late 80s family farm crisis. As we worked alongside farmers to adapt the play to their realities, Moliere's play about religious hypocrisy became a story of the disintegration of the family farm. We'd originally planned to be edgy and relevant, and we were going to do Tartuffe as an expose of televangelism, but that quickly faded into irrelevance. As professional artists, we had to pose some of the questions, but we did not hold all. We frankly didn't hold even many of the answers. We learned about perseverance, about eating lunch with the tribal elders on a Paiute Native American reservation in Nevada for 30 days in a row until an understandably wary tribal elder finally agreed to be in our adaptation of the Greek tragic trilogy, the Oresteia. We learned to bartend so that the husband and wife owners of the bar in a Badlands town with a population of 190, Main Street was a dirt road, could play Horatio and Gertrude in a Wild West version of Hamlet. That was our first ever community-based adaptation, and it was motivated by a Sunday school teacher who threatened to quit the show, which in turn launched a community-wide investigation into Shakespeare's blasphemy and our, I now quote a rancher who hit the nail on the head, our smart-ass college kid rewrites. Our adaptation eventually, after we really dug in with the community, it incorporated much more local slang, and it was both richer and much more authentic for that effort. We learned to give up power as sole decision makers in order to make better art. Most pressingly, we learned to follow the community's lead in times of crisis. 11-year-old Tiffany Dozier was killed by gang gunfire in front of our performance site after a dance in the LA neighborhood of Pacoima, just weeks before our opening night. We wondered if it was responsible to have another nighttime event at this same facility so soon after this tragic murder. The cast, which included friends and relatives of Tiffany, told us that the play had to go on because of Tiffany's death. We learned to move out of our comfort zone in order to expand who was in the room. We learned to seek source texts outside the Western canon. We learned to do passages of plays in Spanish, Mandarin, Korean, Tagalog, and American Sign Language to create access through language. We learned again and again to find the courage to talk to the person in the room with whom you are certain you have the least in common and who makes you the most afraid. For me, it was usually guys with gun racks in the back of their pickup trucks, some of whom went on to become my colleagues and my friends. We learned to assume that everything is possible. In Mississippi, we cast as Romeo a high school senior who had failed the state literacy test twice. He was going to receive a certificate of attendance, but no diploma. Soon after mastering his leading role, our Romeo passed that state literacy test with flying colors, and he graduated from high school. In an LA neighborhood, we undertook a 3-play cycle. In the first show, we cast a young woman named Stephanie Escobar. In the second production, Stephanie's mother joined as an assistant stage manager, and her brother Andrew ran the soundboard. By the third production, her sister Laura was on the backstage crew, and their father, a bus driver by day, was playing in the show's band. We learned that the arts are one of the few activities in which multiple generations of a single family can participate together. And we became determined to be an arts organization that created more opportunities like that for families. We learned that to build something worthwhile, we had to take the time to engage deeply. We did our original productions in 6 weeks, from arriving in town through closing, 6 weeks. By late in my time at Cornerstone, we devoted over 4.5 years to a faith-based cycle of plays, creating individual projects with distinct Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, and other religious communities, including a community of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people of multiple faiths, and then bringing together members of all of those faith-based communities into what we called a bridge show. Even the title of that play itself got to the heart of the matter. The play's title was called A Long Bridge Over Deep Waters. The character of a gay Muslim young man in this culminating project led to huge dissension and huge division. Eventually, all the straight Muslim cast members quit the show. But there were hours and hours of excruciating and meaningful conversation that opened many of our hearts and minds. Today, Cornerstone doesn't conceive of working in a community without it being conceived as part of a larger, longer-term cycle of projects that will culminate in a bridge show. I'm still on what we learned, by the way. We learned that we should cross lines too. As a professional arts organization, we had a responsibility to help found or strengthen local resources that would exist long after our residency ended. After playing a lead in a Cornerstone production, Ron Temple, a farmer who stood 6 feet 9 inches tall, founded an arts organization in his rural Kansas community of Norcator. Years later, a state tourism brochure cited this town with a population of 220, as, quote, being known far and wide for its arts and culture. During his Cornerstone show, Ron turned his farm over to his daughters and his sons-in-law, and he spent 14 hours a day rehearsing and trying to learn his lines. This acting thing, Ron said to a camera crew from CBS Evening News, is a lot like sex. Everybody knows a little bit about it, but it's the technique that counts. The wisdom of Ron Temple. Guillermo Aviles was a high school senior who planned to enlist in the military after graduation. When he was cast in a leading part in a Cornerstone production in the San Miguel neighborhood of the LA community of Watts, the director persuaded this talented young man to apply to college to study theater. Guillermo not only became the first in his family to achieve higher education, he got his master's degree and eventually his doctorate as well. With a portion of box office proceeds from the Cornerstone Project in Watts, Guillermo co-founded the Watts Village Theater Company, which is still creating work almost 30 years later. We learned that you often can't know the ripples of the work and that you have to maintain faith. 3 years after our controversial and very successful biracial Romeo and Juliet in Port Gibson, Mississippi, the town had created only one biracial show on its own. And I'm going to confess to you tonight that I felt ashamed. I feared that we had failed these folks in the long haul, even though the project had in many ways put our company on the map. We were on the cover of American Theater magazine. We were in the Sunday New York Times Arts and Leisure section. We began to attract National Foundation grants. But the community had only done one biracial play. Yet, when revisiting the community 3 years later as part of a national tour, at least 20 people told us the same story. Port Gibson had become part of Main Street USA, which was a federally funded program for small towns to revitalize their main streets. The community had recently been honored for having, out of 435 Main Street USA towns, the most racially integrated board in the United States. It was because of the play, was the constant refrain. We all met, and we all learned to trust each other through the play. The results of artistic work that strengthen community cannot be measured solely through an artistic lens. In the 1980s, when we started our company, we were constantly asked whether what we were doing was art or social work, as if nobody could conceive of art as being something that is central to social justice. Cornerstone doesn't get asked that question anymore because the way people perceive art has changed over the years. There's so many individuals and companies throughout our nation, including here in the Boston area, that have been at the vanguard of participatory art making. And I'm optimistic enough to believe that the rest of our society is starting to catch up with what many of you already know. When I began thinking about the possibility of landing in Ashland, Oregon, I had a moment of panic. Was I giving up my life's commitment to community-based art? The festival was a very different company from Cornerstone, almost 90 years old, with an operating budget in my final seasons of over $44 million. About 400,000 tickets were sold to audience members, including students, most of whom came from hundreds of miles away, and the largest acting company in the United States, performing over 800 performances of 11 plays in rotating repertory. So it operated on a different scale and with a different focus than I was used to. But the panic passed when I remembered again what had drawn me to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. We call it OSF for short. Okay, so I'm going to share a somewhat embarrassing but hopefully revealing story. In 2002, I directed my first show in Ashland as a guest artist. The artistic director at the time, an amazing woman named Libby Apple, took me out to dinner and asked me what I'd like to be doing 5 years into the future. And I didn't even think, I just blurted out, I think I'd like to be in your job. My job is not available, was her stern response. I stammered that I knew that, and I had planned to stay at Cornerstone for the rest of my life anyway, and I don't know why I said that. But upon further reflection, I realized that my unedited response had revealed that I'd fallen in love with a new set of challenges. And of course, you know what my blurted comment led to. 5 years later, almost to the day, was the beginning of my full-time tenure as artistic director of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. There is power, everybody, in articulating your dreams out loud. In the intervening dozen years, my team and I at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival actively worked to adapt. I thought it was time to work in the theme of the talk. Did you get that? Yeah? To adapt and to expand how we achieve the festival's mission to reveal our collective humanity by building an ever more inclusive theater. We added community partners to expand the circle of stakeholders in our work. As one example, we produced the world premiere of a play called Welcome Home, Jenny Sutter. It was a play about a female Marine returning from Iraq. Did you see that? Oh, that makes me so happy. That makes me even happier. Amazing. So it's about a female Marine returning home from Iraq, and in a first for the festival, we enlisted our local VFW branch to partner with us, advising us, building a panel of vets who met with the cast, and helping to organize an initiative in which all veterans, active duty military personnel, and reservists would receive 2 free tickets throughout the run. We also erected a remembrance tree in the lobby for audience members to honor loved ones who had served our country. After the opening performance, an audience member grabbed me in the lobby and said, "I'm a wounded Marine vet. You people nailed it, and I thank you." And he started to cry. By inviting vets to come for free, we're also sending a very deliberate message to the wider audience that this play was one that needed to be seen by everyone, regardless of on one's position on the war in Iraq. We launched American Revolutions. Yes, the United States History Cycle. We commissioned 37 new plays, the magic number in OSF's official count of the Shakespeare canon, to help establish shared vocabulary about our national identity. William Shakespeare lived in an age of anxiety, especially the question of who was going to replace the childless monarch Elizabeth. And in response, he wrote history plays that examined the transfer of power in his country's past. So inspired by the spirit and the scale of Shakespeare's work, we set out to build a canon of plays that could help us learn from our country's past in order to illuminate best paths for our future. Under the thematic umbrella of American Revolutions, all the plays each looked at a moment of change in U.S. history. We collaborated not only with playwrights, but with historians and other academic experts to create the most vibrant possible body of work. Within my 12 seasons at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, we've mounted 13 American Revolutions commissioned plays, most of which moved on to multiple productions around the country. In fact, 4 American Revolutions plays performed on Broadway within a 5-year span. As exciting as that was, I was equally, if not more proud, when American Revolutions plays like Lynn Nottage's Sweat, like Paula Vogel's Indecent, or Lisa Loomer's Row about Roe v. Wade began to be performed in community theaters and in colleges. I do believe that the deepest impact on the American theater can be had through influencing the amateur canon. Allison Carey, a very important person in my life, she co-founded Cornerstone, and then she moved to Ashland to run the History Cycle. She liked to say that American Revolutions is a lot like Cornerstone, except the community we're working with is the entire United States. Late in my tenure, we launched another cycle of commissioned plays called Play on Shakespeare. We asked American playwrights at various points of their career to each translate a Shakespeare play into contemporary English. When I committed to this cycle, I thought, well, if nothing else comes from it, the playwrights are going to become better writers after a deep dive with a work by William Shakespeare. So you can imagine my delight that this organization spun off as its own nonprofit that is still going strong, and these adaptations, or translations, as the more accurate name is for what they use for them, are being produced by professional and university theaters all over the country. OSF also has what's called a green show that provides pre-show entertainment, free of charge, from early June to early October. For almost 50 years, the green show hosted Renaissance dancers and Elizabethan music. In a move that was most directly inspired by my time at Cornerstone, we opened up the Green Show to include an ever-rotating bill of fare that would include artists from our own region and artists from as far away as Mexico City or New York, performers who were local youth, performers who were professionals working at the peak of their craft. Each night the programming would change from, say, classical violinists to hip-hop dancers who specialize in crumping. For a theater that relies heavily on tourists as audience, the Green Show also became a gift to our local community as it was wildly popular with local audiences. An acting company can and should grow through shared training. Early in my tenure, I appointed a director of company development, Scott Kaiser. His job was not only to help identify new company members, but also to maximize opportunities for growth of the current company. We held weekly ateliers, which were skill-building workshops that were open to the entire acting company. At various points, we had physical trainers. We had Alexander and Feldenkrais teachers. We had dancing and singing coaches on staff. With budget challenges over the years, many of those measures of progress eroded, but that's topic for another talk. I'm also thrilled that some of our actors asked to grow in new directions by helping to direct or to choreograph. It was eye-opening for everyone involved to have members of the acting company sit on the other side of the rehearsal room table. Both at Cornerstone and in Ashland, we constantly wrestled with questions of inclusion. And those questions are, of course, at the heart of building bridges. And it's impossible to talk about inclusion without talking about racism. Our performing arts field, as well as, of course, our entire nation, is built on the pernicious foundation of white supremacy. Any attempt to deny that or to cloak white supremacy in other terms like excellence or tradition, is actually setting our field backward and doing real damage to the future generations whose budding spirits we are entrusted to nurture. At OSF, we held forums on white privilege that generated some controversy. For some company members, the very title was a racist affront. One staff member wrote me, "I have a strong feeling that the festival would like me to wear a button that says, 'I'm sorry, I'm white.'" For others, white privilege wasn't an accusation, but a neutral term of fact, acknowledging a dramatically unlevel playing field. Issues of class also reverberated strongly at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival and our field, both in terms of privileges that come based on proximity to the work on stage. What is the privilege that an actor has as opposed to a stagehand, for instance, but also privilege based on compensation level. Now, I want to be clear. Do I think that we all need to have the same political perspective, the same aesthetic point of view, the same beliefs in terms of how we approach the fact of our diversity? Do I think we should put all our energy into trying to eliminate every possible interpersonal conflict? Absolutely not. But I do believe that our work will be stronger if there are spaces for us to increase our trust, if we can learn to speak without fear about difficult issues. Our art demands that we explore with openness and with candor some of the toughest questions that face humankind. How can we do that in an environment of fear or an environment that has a lack of trust? I've devoted my life to theater because I believe that it is a rehearsal for changing the world, not to resolve the contradictions, as the great theater artist Robbie McCauley once said, but to house the contradictions, not to resolve the contradictions, but to house the contradictions. I've had the privilege of frequent guest teaching and teaching ongoing courses in various academic settings. I've even had the honor of a named professorship in one institution. In one of those theater departments, I found a spirit of true camaraderie. It was radically different and radically better when my fellow faculty members and I were genuinely cheering each other's successes and trying to help one another to solve problems. What we collectively modeled to our students as a group of colleagues was far more profound and more long-lasting than any wisdom that any one of us might have shared in our individual classrooms. As an Ivy League educated, middle-aged white man, late middle-aged white man, I am the beneficiary of, and I am misshapen by multiple layers of privilege. The more time I spend trying to be a better ally, the more I'm gobsmacked by how people's identities can be weaponized against them, which we see in such stark terms in today's political climate. So as I think about the adaptations that I've made in my 3 artistic directorships, here are some things that I want to remind myself every day. How can I embrace and not avoid the hard conversations? How can I remember that conflict of ideas is not the same as interpersonal conflict? When I find my blood pressure rising when someone is speaking, rather than shutting down, how can I instead get more curious and actually open doors in that moment? How can I recognize that my language, so self-evident to me, may in fact be completely foreign to my listener? Can I assume goodwill? Can I ask clarifying questions? Can I operate on facts, not myths? Can I climb down that old ladder of inference that I race up based on all my assumptions and my prejudices? And when spoken or written language just aren't working, can I resort to a kind of charades, putting my tension into laughter instead of expressions of anger? I want to save my righteous anger for those special moments when I see that I really can change the world, or at least change my own workplace for the better. Life is short, to borrow from the Buddhist saying, and quarrels exist because we forget that fact. How can I help create more and more empathy wherever I am blessed to work? There will always be gaps between ideas and language, gaps between your perceptions and my perceptions, gaps between your feelings and my feelings. But here's the cool part. In the performing arts, and I would argue in education in general, we are in the business of navigating those untraversable gaps, of building bridges across difference. And we know as arts makers, and we know as educators, that it is in the gaps, in what is seemingly untranslatable, that the drama often happens. Okay, I'm going to share a quick personal story from Cornerstone. This goes back 20 years, over 20 years ago. To celebrate the turning of the millennium, we were doing a large-scale bridge project that brought together members of each of the 14 communities in greater Los Angeles that we had worked with so far. I greeted the cast at the first rehearsal, and I realized that a good half of the people in the circle knew that I was a gay man, while those communities from projects from our earlier years in LA did not, because I had not yet been comfortable in those days to share that part of my identity. At that moment, literally at that moment, my husband Chris, an actor in the company, wheeled in a stroller with our newborn son, Liam. I realized that this was not a moment for internalized homophobia, that in fact, it was a moment of truth in my life. I quickly introduced Chris as my partner, and I introduced our new son, Liam. My pride and my family, though, mixed with a toxic anxiety about how certain community members would respond. My fears focused like a laser beam on one particular woman of whom I was particularly fond. She was a middle-aged, black, devout Christian from the neighborhood of Watts. My own cultural biases, including my own racism, kicked in as I imagined her reaction to my announcement. The painful comments that were going to accompany her immediately quitting the show. I'm ashamed to tell you that I couldn't even look her in the eye as I continued to address the cast. We got to the first rehearsal break. She leapt from her chair. She raced across the room, right toward me. And I thought, oh boy, here it comes. "Where's that baby?" She shouted. "That baby is the luckiest baby in the whole world to have two such wonderful dads. Let me hold him." Again and again, my life has been filled with such moments of grace. My work at Cornerstone, my work in Oregon, and now in New York has constantly retaught me what it's so easy to forget: the astonishing beauty of each and every single human being. It always surprises me anew in the way that the deepest truths do, a truth whose power you've somehow forgotten, but that you embrace and you hold tight like a dear old friend at a school reunion decades after your graduation. One of the hardest aspects of my final days in Ashland was the, to me, surprising pushback on my legacy. It's not new, of course. We had a horrendous summer in 2016. We were doing The Wiz on our outdoor stage. the black version of The Wizard of Oz musical. A local bookstore juxtaposed in the storefront window The Wizard of Oz and Little Black Sambo, claiming that they just happened to be examples of books that were once banned. OSF tried to reason with the store owner, but our efforts backfired, leading to her false claims that our giant nonprofit was trying to oppress her rights to free speech and that we were boycotting her business. Her husband wrote for the local paper, and we found ourselves on the losing end, very much the losing end of a nightmarish PR battle. After a black actor subsequently faced a racially charged death threat from a man riding by on a bicycle, we posted Black Lives Matter signs all over our campus in response to both episodes. Our organization's commitment to social justice was criticized by many, and I learned the limitations of tolerance, especially of self-defined liberal white people sometimes. Even as I've sometimes been trounced for being an active ally, I recognize that what I've experienced is a fraction of the hardships faced by my colleagues of color. Change doesn't come readily. Change doesn't come cheap. The exhausting hits to emotional and physical health are often much more costly than the dollars and the cents, but refusing to adapt is a non-starter. Cornerstone's ensemble, an all-white group of college friends, morphs into one of the most multiracial ensembles in the country, which, by the way, was sprung by a collective decision to give up a certain amount of guaranteed weeks of employment to make room for more colleagues of color. That's how we began that. OSF's acting company, which you heard a little bit about already, the nation's largest, transformed from 22% actors of color when I first arrived, which was already impressive for a large budget theater at that time, to becoming 70% actors of color in my final seasons. The definition of classics, they were always European or American, period, full stop, expands to include Sanskrit, Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, and Nigerian classics. Asian classics are performed multiracially, like Shakespeare, we say defensively, until the casting process of Yellowface is named. And we have to admit that when it comes to classics authored by writers of color, the casting playing field is not and cannot be treated as level. Over the years, we build on an annual commitment to one African-American author in each season playbill, adding similar annual commitments to Asian American, to Latinx, to Native American authors. After years of a deaf actor in our acting company being understudied by hearing actors who try to learn American Sign Language while also asking the uncomfortable question, am I supposed to be pretending to be deaf? The ethical choice is finally made. Deaf actors need deaf understudies. These measures of progress are not accidents, and they're not inevitabilities. These are choices to responsibly, deliberately adapt, to build a bridge between what was and what could be. The scene changes, the rules change, language changes, and we'll keep changing. So how do we get ahead of it all? How can those of us who lead a room be led by our collaborators? How can those of us who teach allow ourselves to be taught by our students? Teaching, after all, is like artistic collaboration. It's always a mutual act of learning and growing. As I reflect on the horrors of too many laws that restrict rights and too many mass killings, I am struck all the more by the urgency of the work that we need to undertake in the performing arts and in education. How can the Academy join hands with the professional performing arts scene? How do we each contribute every day to a culture that nurtures rather than warps young people? I'm going to move toward closing these two long remarks by speaking briefly about my current professional chapter. The Perelman Performing Arts Center, PAC NYC, is the last piece of the puzzle in the rebuilding of the World Trade Center. I was not looking to leave the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, as it really is one of the truly great theaters in the United States. The work there consistently challenged me and nourished my spirit. In the end, though, there were two opportunities at PAC NYC that led me to throw my hat into the ring for that job at this new startup. I get to program a flexible and yet intimate, multidisciplinary performing arts facility with music, dance, and chamber opera in addition to theater. It's supposed to be good for you to be scared about new challenges and opportunities. And believe me, I had and I have lots of fear about programming art forms in which my ignorance knows no bounds. But I am growing in all sorts of new ways. The other attraction was the location itself, the responsibility to create work inspired by the sacred ground on which our building stands. Can we offer an artistic alternative to what we mean by world trade? Not only an expression of capitalism to be exported to the rest of the world, but an investment in true equity of culture. How can we connect the dots between accomplished international artists and low-income immigrant families from those nations who live within New York City's 5 boroughs? How can we bring people together across all manners of difference to reveal our shared humanity? Everyone in this country has some combination of indigenous, enslaved, and/or immigrant roots. How can we, with every single project, foreground that deep truth about our country and all the peril and the promise that lie within it? In a month, I begin rehearsals for my first directorial effort at PAC NYC. It's about the first time, it's also the first time, it's about the first time, and it's also the first time that I've directed a new show in 5 years. The last new production I made 5 years ago was my final one at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. It was called La Comedia of Errors. It was an adaptation in which one set of twins had been raised in Mexico and the other set of twins in the US. The script was 50% English and 50% Spanish. And we worked hard, in part with the help of an audience plant, to make sure that the show was truly accessible and enjoyable for monolingual Spanish speakers, for monolingual English speakers, and of course for those who were lucky enough to speak both languages. We toured the show to community centers throughout Southern Oregon with high numbers of Spanish speakers, as well as performing it on the set of whatever play happened to be playing on our OSF main stages that night. It's no accident that my final production at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival as artistic director was truly Cornerstone inspired, an adaptation that sought to build a joyfully comic bridge across a border between two cultures. And now, half a decade later, I'm about to go into rehearsal as co-director of another production. Improbably enough, this is Andrew Lloyd Webber's iconic musical, Cats. But our production has a subtitle, Cats, the Jellicle Ball, because in our adaptation, are you getting the adaptation theme? Am I getting that clear? Which we're honored, really honored, to have received rights from Andrew Lloyd Webber's company. Cat is slang for a person who walks the runway in ballroom culture. When it says ballroom, I mean the movement that roared out of queer, black, and brown New York City communities over 50 years ago, right? So it's think Pose, Paris is Burning, Madonna's Vogue, not foxtrots and waltzes. And here I am, 40 years into my career, once again inviting two communities. Our cast includes musical theater legends and ballroom icons to build a bridge through a new work of art. As I very much sit in the later part of middle age these days, and as my workplace is on such sacred ground, reflecting 400 years of trauma and resilience, I find myself thinking about time. So I want you to picture a gorgeous island teeming with life in every season. The original inhabitants encounter and are then violently displaced by strangers from across the sea. Through the gateway of this island's sheltering harbor, waves and waves of immigrants from other lands arrive and build a new nation, predicated on the principle that all are equal, even as we often fall short of that goal. Every day when I enter the building where I work, I pass the North Memorial Pool where the North Twin Tower once stood. Every day I'm reminded that what seems permanent is revealed to be as temporary as are our brief lives on this planet. And may we all have the humility to remember just how brief our little lives are. We blink, and a marble cube arises from the ashes, conceived to house live performance in the naive and yet noble need to shed some light on the beautiful and terrible darkness of the human heart. We adapt, but the larger goal never changes. All of us in the performing arts world, we aspire to make a difference through the magic of telling stories, because we know in a deep place in our souls, transient beings that we are, there is something eternal, and there's something necessary in the very act of communal storytelling. Since the only constant in life is change, how do we choose to navigate the need for adaptation that inevitably arrives in our lives? We have in this audience young people who will be on the front lines, shaping the future of the American performing arts and many other fields as well. I look forward to witnessing and partnering with you to sculpt the inevitable adaptations for our society. If we keep listening and we keep opening our hearts to our fellow travelers, I have faith that together we can all continue to build the bridges that just might bring us together. That's the end. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was wonderful. My question is, so I've heard of Sweat, the play by Lynn Nottage. I didn't realize it was commissioned, and I was wondering what the process of commissioning a play entails, because I was wondering how much of it, do you pick a topic and then ask a playwright to write about it, or do you pick a theme and then ask them to pick a time in history, or how does that work?
That's a great question. Often a commission will be asking an artist to do whatever they want, right? And that's the best kind of commission. But with American Revolutions, it was a themed commission. So we put out, when we reached out to writers, we said, would you like to write a play on the theme of change in United States history? And Lynn Nottage said, yeah, that sounds interesting. I have no idea what I'll write about, but that sounds interesting. And maybe a couple years into the commissioning process, she was talking to a friend, like a peer, who had become homeless. And she was so startled by that. And she read in the New York Times that Reading, Pennsylvania had become, by certain standards, the poorest city in the country. And so she went to Reading to do research. And she met with a lot of people in Reading, and she wrote the play Sweat out of that, and we premiered it. I will just say very quickly that we are doing another themed commissioning program right now at my current organization, PAC NYC. It's called the Democracy Cycle. And I know we have some democracy thinkers and experts in this room, so that's an honor to be talking with some of you in this room. So we are commissioning 25 works of art, music, dance, theater, opera, that in some way shed light on democracy. And we'll be doing 3 years of open calls, and then panels will just pick what those projects are. So it'll be, because it felt more democratic to have them be panel selected.
You had mentioned that you were talking about deaf actors and like the use of ASL, and I was just wondering if, like I've heard a lot of deaf actors say like how much the cultural aspect of deafness can affect adaptation. So I was just curious if you had any like anecdotes or like thoughts or experiences on that.
Yeah, I mean, the first project that we did at Oregon Shakespeare Festival with a deaf actor, I'm a little embarrassed to tell you that the deaf actor, Howie Seago, a great actor, did his own translations of his lines into ASL. And we did not, because Howie is very oral, we did not always have interpreters around. And that shifted over the years to a much more serious investment and serious commitment to deaf culture surrounding deaf artists. So as I mentioned in the speech, deaf understudies as well as deaf actors, not only multiple interpreters in the rehearsal room, but an artistic, a director of artistic sign language. So somebody whose job was to translate English or whatever language the play was in into sign language in an artistic way. So I think that profoundly the work and the company transformed in terms of the culture.
I was also curious, like, did it impact like any storylines at all? I think is also what I was curious about.
Absolutely. Obviously in a new play, it literally impacts the writing of the play, but in a classic, the choice, I will give you an example. Actually, a year later, after that first production, I directed a production of Hamlet, and that same actor, Howie Seago, played the ghost of Hamlet's father. And did you see that one? Okay, that's all right. We can still be friends. You saw that one. So he played the ghost of Hamlet's father, and when Hamlet goes off for the big scene with his father, it was done entirely through ASL. There was no spoken English, and we had planned to project the words on the wall, but people were so moved in the rehearsal room by just the two of them signing, and people who didn't know any sign language and just said, I knew everything I needed to know, and we cut the projections. But the beautiful thing was the actor who played Hamlet, Dan, we were working through the script in advance of the rehearsal process, and we were talking about what it meant for Hamlet to have a deaf father and what it meant for them to have this bond, this language between them that they could communicate in after death. And we cut to Hamlet's last line, and neither of us had thought about it. Hamlet's last line is, "The rest is silence." And that was deep, right? Because you hope with a strong artistic choice that you'll learn why you made it or what it could yield, over time. But when we got to that, it was like, there you go. So yes, it impacts the story, of course. Anytime you include a language other than the language the piece is written in, it changes the story.
So I think post-COVID, we're kind of in a moment where there's a lot of talk about how theater is changing in the US and how the not-for-profit theater is changing. So as someone in the forefront of the not-for-profit theater in this country, what are you most excited about the future of not-for-profit theater in the US? And what are you most concerned about the future and state of the not-for-profit theater in the US?
I don't know if I could pick one thing and answer each question, but some things that immediately come to mind. I'm really excited about, it's what I said in the speech, right? The increasing blurring of lines between professional and community, the increased commitment to equity and to inclusion. I'm excited by the blurring of lines between different disciplines. I talked about music, dance, opera, but as one colleague said to me recently, it's all theater. It's all theater. Even if it's not called theater, it's theater. And I do feel like more and more artists are working at the meeting place between different disciplines and bridging those gaps, building those bridges. What I'm most concerned about is the economic model is completely, how can I word it that's not a swear word? We're a little bit screwed economically, and I don't mean other people are doing that to us. I mean just everything, right? And ticket prices keep going up. There are wealthy people who are willing, or upper middle class people who are willing to spend more and more on tickets, and the work gets more and more expensive. So more and more organizations rely. I will confess to you something disturbing. My 12 years at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, we radically increased the number of artists of color, the number of opportunities for women, directing, writing, designing, everything. And the work got much richer and much more diverse. we grew the company to pay for all of that expansion. We grew the company from a $22 million to a $44 million operating budget. We doubled the size of the company in my 12 years. The audience to pay for that increase became a little wealthier, a little better educated, and a little older. It also did become a little more racially diverse. But in terms of the way I would hope the theater field would move, it moved in the wrong direction in terms of older, richer, better educated. So I think it's an enormous challenge, and we're really facing it right now at PAC NYC, because our beautiful marble cube, it's such a powerful building, very expensive to operate. And, I was shocked as a lifelong theater practitioner to learn that theater is considered the most affordable of all the performing arts disciplines. Theater actually, because there are long runs that can amortize the cost of building the work. A dance concert might be a weekend. A music concert might be one night. An opera, where the singers can only sing every other day and maybe there's 3 or 5 performances, the most expensive show in our season is an opera, and we're going to do it 5 times. So I'm very worried about the economics. But then again, for thousands of years, at least hundreds of years, people have been worried about the future of performing arts fields, and amazing young artists and leaders figure out how to make it work in new ways.
You talked a lot about building bridges between various communities and people groups, but I want to ask you more of a personal question about your life.
Okay.
How have you managed to build the bridges between the multiple facets of your identity, from being a performer, a director, an artist, to being part of administration of these organizations, to even being a father and a husband?
What a lovely question. It's a work in progress. Work in progress, yeah. That's the expression. I struggle with that. I think it's a strength, but of course your strengths are also your liabilities. I think it's my ability to compartmentalize is a strength. So I talked about that dissension with the gay Muslim character in that bridge show. We had a 4-hour meeting, and people were saying stunningly, to me as a gay man, stunningly hurtful things in that circle. But I was so good at compartmentalizing that I was just really happy as the director of the play that everybody was sitting in the circle and talking. And I wasn't taking that in personally, And that's a strength and a potential limitation. I missed my son's first day of kindergarten to direct a play across the country. And that's a decision I'll regret for the rest of my life. That was the wrong choice. And the great irony was it was at a theater where one of my best friends ran the theater. And I could have just said, James Bundy. And I could have just said, I have to come a day late. We have to start rehearsal a day later. But I didn't, because I thought, but I do think I've gotten better. Like, I didn't miss the soccer games after missing that first day of kindergarten. So I think I've gotten better at prioritization and proportion of commitment. Am I answering your question to some degree? Okay, thank you.
I just have a question. You talked about Cornerstone a lot, and how it was trying to make it more inclusive. But on the other side of it, have you ever had, or you ever worked with one of the people from the community that wasn't so giving and wasn't so nice with the other castmates or towards you? Or how did that look like on the opposite side? Were there people that were kind of against it or anything like that?
Sure, absolutely. There are people who quit projects. There are people who were fired from projects, including community participants, that we would have to let go, whether it was a substance abuse issue or a abusive behavior, language. But those are the exceptions, honestly, and if it feels like I shared a lot of feel-good stories, it's because that's what I've been most hit by again and again and again, is when you invite people to come together across difference, and there's equal respect for, both sides of that difference in the room, really beautiful things happen again and again and again. But it's never easy. It's never easy. What do you do? That we had an intern who was a young stage management intern, and an actor who was a heroin addict, which we didn't know at the time, said, if you don't help me right now shoot up before I go on stage, I will not enter the stage. That's not something you're taught in school to deal with as a stage manager, right? So there were many, many, many moments of great difficulty and pain, but it's all toward a greater goal that I think proves itself worth it. Great to hang out with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.